Yes, yes, well done, well done. However, we are going over Unholy Death Knight right now. Why? The usual question, why are we going over Unholy Death Knight? We are going after Death Knight because I have been interested in looking at the play rates in the pre-patch, and Unholy Death Knight has gotten a considerable rise. Unholy Death Knight is the third most played spec in Mythic Plus, in keys above 20 when it comes to melee DPS, and it's the third most played melee DPS in raids, in Mythic raids, above everyone but Havok and Sabrogue. So this is particularly interesting to me, not just because of their rise in popularity, but because by this rise in popularity of Unholy, as a result, they're also pretty much strangling the popularity of Frost. As it often happens, like with the Frost Mage popularity deleting Fire Mage, or the aforementioned Subtlety making Assassination way less popular, the same thing Unholy is doing to Frost. So let's go over Unholy DK, see what's changing from the pre-patch we are all playing into Shadowlands and how are they going to look. The first thing we have to point out, please, is to gently disregard pretty much everything that's happening in pre-patch. Some specs do not actually change that much from pre-patch, some specs remain pretty similar. Most of those specs are specs that do not depend on Azerite traits and essences to do their work. This is not the case for Unholy DK. Unholy DK right now is playing with triple Magus of the Dead with the Vision of Perfection to proc them even more. Their damage is bonkers. There is already the addition on the talents to your Army of the Damned, which already spawns a Magus of the Dead. With this Azerite still active, stackable up to 3, it makes it a mess. There is also the addition to Unholy Pact, which can be paired together with Blood of the Enemy as well in Mythic Plus, the other build, unlike instead of Vision of Perfection. And then of course you have the Execute Soul Reaper, which is way more effective right now, where every fight gets zerged down in 3 minutes in raids. So a lot of the things you're seeing in the pre-patch are just to be completely disregarded when it comes to Unholy DK. But before we go over the way they actually play, we have to talk about their niche, right? Because Unholy DK's niche for a long time was very strong AoE. Burst AoE, the term you might have heard before, the quadratic scaling AoE element of Unholy DK, which was very powerful. This has been changed, will be changed with the target capping that Blizzard is going to put on many specs, not just Unholy. Now your Bursting Source is only going to detonate your Festering Wounds up to 8 targets instead of 20, and now you're also going to have your Scourge Strike within Death and Decay only burst 5 targets instead of 20. This of course has heavily limited the amount of wounds you can burst on multiple targets. Before, you could play with Infected Claws, which would make your pet apply these wounds. You could put down Death and Decay with Pestilence, which also had more chances to apply free wounds. And then, with your Death and Decay and your Scourge Strike AoE, essentially, within Death and Decay, you would just burst them all at once. Because of Bursting Source, they would just detonate each other. Constantly massive AoE. Now it's nerfed. Bursting Source is capped at 8 targets and Scourge Strike is capped at 5. This means it's gonna take you more times to burst all these wounds. You're gonna have less GCDs in your window to be able to spend on Epidemic, which is now baseline, so at least you got that. But even with your basic Epidemic, you're still going to have a lower AoE. This of course is going to depend on the amount of enemies that will be pulled in Mythic Plus. There doesn't seem to be much of a change really from the AoE cap constraints of most specs, but Unholy DK has certainly been hit quite a bit by these changes in AoE. Now the payback of this, the return of being hit in AoE, is that your single target has been buffed. Rejoice, because after 9 years your mastery has been changed. You had pretty much the oldest unchanged mastery in the game. Your mastery increased your shadow damage since 2011, and it has remained this way for 9 years until Shadowlands is going to change the mastery, making you have shadow damage and pet damage with your mastery. This is a momentous change because most of the damage from your pet is going to be single target. From your ghoul, the second ghoul from All Will Serve, the Dark Transformation, the Army of the Dead, most of the damage is going to be single target. Some of them, like the Dark Transformation Claw ability becoming AoE, or the Summon Gargoyle AoE ability, or even your Legendary, summoning a Shambler, which is going to do AoE. Those are minor ones, but compared to most of your damage for your pet is going to be single target, and now having guaranteed single target scaling in the late game because of your mastery is very, very good. The other good change, this is not as powerful, but definitely welcome, is going to be Unholy Blight. Now at first glance, you read this, it seems like just another AoE ability. It is on the level 25 row with other AoE abilities. The reason why this is so powerful is because it also has a single target element. Not only does it have the quality of life element of spreading Virulent Plague by itself on all targets hit, but also increasing the damage the target take by your minions by 3% per stack, stacking up 4 times. This means 12% more damage done by your pets for 14 seconds. It's a very powerful tool because it's in an AoE row, and it still does decent AoE damage, but you can also use this for single target. Now, of course, coupled with other things like your Apocalypse, which is still there, but also your Unholy Assault, with the extra effect of instantly infecting the target with 4 festering wounds, you have a more meaty and solid single target after losing some of the AoE. That's the trade you have to do in Shadowlands. No more Magus of the Dead Azerite trades, no more Vision of Perfection, no more Blood of the Enemy. This is the trade you have to go for in Shadowlands. Less AoE, but some more consistent single target. Now, when it comes to your rotation, despite this talk of change for AoE and for single target, it's not that there has been a major change. For your rotation, you want to pull the enemy with Outbreak to apply Virulent Plague. As you get close to the enemy, you want to start using Unholy Blight. You build up a couple of Festering Strikes to build up some wounds. You want to burst the wounds with Apocalypse. You want to build them back up with Unholy Assault. And then turn your main goal in Dark Transformation. Now that you have gotten through Apocalypse and Dark Transformation, your Unholy Blight is fully stacked. It has gotten to 4 stack, meaning your minions are doing 12% more damage from both your Apocalypse and your Dark Transformation, and eventually even your Army of the Dead. So once you've got your full combo ready, you can start spending your runic power with Death Coil and spending your wounds on the target with Scourge Strike. Rebuild it up with Festering Strike, reburst it with Scourge Strike, and dump the runic power with Death Coil. The difference with AoE is that after you have went with a couple of Festering Strikes to build up the wounds, use Unholy Blight to start debuffing all of the enemies with Virulent Plague and pet damage increase. You are using Apocalypse to burst down the wounds you built up with Festering Strikes. You're using Unholy Assault to rebuild them up. The main difference obviously is that after you use Dark Transformation and you're ready to go, before starting your train of Scourge Strikes, you put down Death and Decay. Now, please remember, you do want to make sure you have runes saved up and wounds saved up before you can put down your Death and Decay and spam your Scourge Strikes. Now it is much more important for you to fill the GCDs of the Death and Decay with as many Scourge Strikes as you can, because, as I mentioned, Scourge Strike is now capped at 5 targets within your Death and Decay. So it's pretty important to be able to maximize it to its fullest. In single target, it is unironically barely even worth using Death and Decay. It's going to be doing less than 2% of your total damage. What I mean by this is use it on cooldown, but if there is a more important GCD to use, particularly if you need a rune for something else, then don't spend it on Death and Decay and delay it to whenever you can. But beyond this, the change isn't really major. The only change particularly is going to be around your Unholy Blight. Let it stack for pet damage. Remember that also you can now use Unholy Blight to spread Virulent Plague. You no longer need Outbreak, at least on pull, or at least once every other application of Virulent Plague, since Unholy Blight has a 45-second cooldown and Virulent Plague lasts for 27 seconds. Every other time you want to apply Virulent Plague, you can do it with Unholy Blight in your cycle of cooldowns with Unholy Assault, Apocalypse, and Dark Transformation. Legendaries for Unholy DK are not that impressive when it comes to changing your playstyle and your rotation, but to be fair, not many specs have this kind of diversity. Reanimated Shambler is pretty good when it comes to AoE. The damage is okay, but spreading 8 festering wounds at the same time is going to be very powerful in AoE. Too bad it's completely RNG, so you can't really decide when this happens, which means the chances is you're gonna hit the jackpot and actually make it work at the start of a pool are not going to be that many. That certainty was, of course, much stronger back when Death's Due, the Night Fae Covenant, was also stronger. Now that it has been nerfed, the effect is still powerful, but not that powerful. The Death Coil damage increase by 35% is very good. With this legendary, your Death Coil will be your second strongest damage source after your main ghoul, and your strongest ability in your kit by quite a bit. Reducing the cooldown of Death and Decay is pretty good if you're using, as mentioned, the Night Fae Covenant, since the Night Fae reworked Death and Decay is going to give you 8% strength. With this legendary you would have a permanent 8% strength buff when you're fighting and spending your runic power with Death Call. The only negative is that you do want to have permanent Death and Decay active when you're fighting in AoE, so your Scourge Strike is going to constantly do AoE damage. Unfortunately, To get the cooldown reduction, you have to use Death Call instead of Epidemic. So this is purely a single target legendary, particularly because you can even go for something like Pestilence, Talent, and continuously have chances to apply Festering Wounds on the enemy for single target, which is very powerful. The other two, we alternate a very boring one, Frenzied Monstrosity. It's been nerfed a couple of times already. 12% damage and attack speed during your Dark Transformation, which is fine. It's a fine burst increase. The other one though is the more interesting one. It's going to reduce the runic power cost of Death Call by 10, and Death Call is going to make your Dark Transformation longer by 1 second. You already have a Covenant Soulbind, which most Death Knights are going to go for, which is Eternal Hunger. That is going to increase your Dark Transformation by 3 seconds and its damage by 3%, scaling up eventually later on. This one, when you start at full runic power, for your combo, for your build-up, for your burst, you already guarantee a 5 seconds extra extension of your Dark Transformation. Throughout the build, throughout the setup, it's going to be another 5. So it's going to give you decent value. Not as much as before, where the increase was 2 seconds, obviously, but it's still pretty decent. A word for the two neutral legendaries, which are actually pretty strong right now, because their base effectiveness is very powerful. They will likely become more obsolete as we go deeper into the expansion, but for now, Super Strain and Pheromones are pretty strong. Super Strain is going to give you all 3 Death Knight DOTs at the same time when you apply one of them, which is actually going to be very strong at the start of the expansion, particularly for Blood, for a tank, for aggro. And then you have Pheromones, which is a guaranteed 15% haste within your Death and Decay. Yes, when you will be able to pair up that certainty with Pheromones and the Night Fae Legendary, you will be able to have a permanent 15% haste, 8% strength, Death and Decay on yourself. So that's going to be interesting. But for now, it's a good one. 15% haste is going to feel very nice at the start of the expansion because of the poorness of your stats. And now we have to look at the last part of their kit, which is their talents. Now, I have bitched and complained about the last couple of specs we have went over when it came to talents, the Balance Druid and the Subrogue, mentioning how much more stuck in multiple talents they were in. Now, when it comes to Unholy, they do have quite some variety they can choose. None of it is extremely exciting, but at least they have the option. Remember when I talked about Havoc, how much I agree the philosophy of having options and choice when you want to do something. For example, in the first row, right now everyone is going for All Will Serve. Now it's just broken in the pre-patch, it's not very strong in Shadowlands right now. Cloven Shadow is just going to be better QOL use of your Scourge Strike, and then Infected Claws is going to be much stronger for AoE situations. Second row, same thing, Bursting Source paired together with Infected Claws for your usual wound build in Mythic Plus. And then you have Unholy Blight, which is going to be your new to-go single target talent, which is also just fine in AoE, and it's going to be stronger if you're trying to move away from the wound build because of the target capping and you're trying to go for a more linear type of AoE damage. The level 35 row has a similar amount of choice because now your Soul Reaper can work as your new Execute talent, which you can take whenever you can find lots of value in an Execute situation. Your Pestilent Pulse is going to be obviously AoE oriented because more wounds burst is going to be more chances to give you Runic Corruption, one of your passives. And then you have Harbinger of Doom, which is going to be for extra QOL usage of your Sudden Doom. Now, it is important to mention, very important in fact, that your Sudden Doom now is going to work not just with your Death Call anymore, but also with your Epidemic. So Harbinger of Doom not only is it going to be strong for single target, but just for AoE as well. So you have Soul Reaper, which is primarily for your single target execute, you have Pestilent Pustules, which is going to have more value in AoE, and Harbinger of Doom, which is going to be for both. That's a very nice type of talent row. A type of talent row that's a little bit more disappointing is the level 45 row, because right now Unholy Pact is pretty much taking up the entire row. The fact that Dark Transformation is also going to give you 5% of your strength is essentially strangling the other two choices when it comes to single target. On top of the fact that the AoE damage Dark Transformation would give you was already relevant enough to combat Defile and Pestilence, but now with the extra strength, it just beats them all for single target. Pestilence is still going to be the overall stronger pick for more broad AoE situations, but Unholy Pact is just a more variable and versatile. And then you have the last row, as I mentioned, forget this being a thing from the pre-patch about Army of the Dead with your Magus Azerite traits. So yeah, this Army of the Damned is going to lose a lot of value once the Magus Azerite trait is going to be lost. Unholy Assault is just more synergistic with your Apocalypse that you already have in your kit. The loss of the Azerite traits are definitely going to hurt this one in Shadowlands. In Shadowlands it's still going to be valuable, but just not at the start, not compared to Unholy Assault, which doesn't have much of any scaling. It's just a nice hit with 20% haste and 4 guaranteed generation of festering wounds. Army of the Dead probably requires more time to scale. Remember that Army of the Dead also has Convocation of the Dead, which is a soulbind conduit, which is going to reduce the cooldown of Apocalypse by another 0.5 seconds whenever a festering wound is generated, which is going to scale up to 2-second cooldown reduction. With Army of the Dead, extra second of cooldown reduction is going to be probably scaling very well together, but for now it's pretty weak. It's on the weaker side compared to Unholy Assault at least. I would say that when it comes to talents, you know, it could have been worse. It could have been in a worse situation. You have enough choices right now, which will most likely change as we go deeper into the scaling of the expansion with more gear and more stats. And for now they are, I would say, acceptable. I wouldn't complain as much as I would if I was playing, for example, Balance Druid from my last video. I haven't touched on Covenant abilities because they are rather boring, beyond, of course, the legendary synergy of the Death Dew for the Night Fae. They don't really add anything to the build in any way. I do have to say that they might be slightly hurt by this loss of niche, because before they did have a very clear power level when it came to AoE and burst AoE. Now that has gone down slightly. Yes, their AoE has been lowered in exchange for a stronger and more stable single target. However, we are dangerously shifting closer to the situation I mentioned about other specs, about not having a 10 out of 10 damage profile and a 5 out of 10 damage profile, but rather having a bunch of 7 out of 10s. In my opinion, it is more valuable, and you will have more chances of being taken into a raid and being part of a raid group, or even a Mythic Plus key, if you have a very clear and defined 10 out of 10, 9 out of 10 damage profile, be it burst AoE, sustained AoE, or burst single target, and then a very clear weakness like a 5 out of 10, you know, a 6 out of 10 in another damage profile, so that you can still be taken for what you're very, very strong at. So Unholy DK has been weakened in AoE by quite a bit and has been strengthened in single target by quite a bit. It will be up for discussion and debate whether or not the nerf to their AoE has weakened them enough to not make them desirable when it comes to needing AoE classes, and if the buff to their single target has made them desirable enough to be considered a very good single target spec. Otherwise, as I mentioned, they risk ending in the limbo of the Jack of all trades, master of none, you know, 7 out of 10 spec that doesn't excel at anything, so it doesn't really get taken for anything. But we'll have to see. For me, they're still fine. They're still more than good enough. I haven't even touched on the fact that they have a near guaranteed spot in raids because of anti-magic zone. I was being a little bit too dramatic. Now, with this we are done with Unholy DK. The next one is going to be, I don't know, but it's going to be a ranged DPS spec. We will see which one. And after this, I'll be taking my leave. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I'm off because I really need to go eat.